Hey there, friends. David Lightbringer here. Welcome to Kill A Mockingbird. This is the long-promised and long-awaited Sansa will skin change birds video, and also the how and where Sansa will kill Petyr Baelish video, and also the Sansa episode of Norse mythology of Ice and Fire. We've done one of those for Bloodraven, Jon Snow, Bran Stark, Arya Stark, and Oberyn Martell so far, and today it's Sansa's turn, and that means we're going to talk about the very cool Norse myth of Idunn, and you might hear it said Idunn. It's that it's the hard TH, it's kind of like a D. Anyway, she keeps the apples of immortality, and she's abducted by a giant eagle Yotu named Thiazi, and George Martin has used all of that mythology with Sansa's plot with Petyr Baelish and being abducted to the Eyrie. It's very, very cool, and it's also the reason why Sansa is named after an apple. All of this ties in directly to the Ghost of High Heart's vision of Sansa slaying a giant in a castle made of ice. And then, of course, we have the Ghost of High Heart's that's right, there's two visions of Sansa, and in the other one she appears as the Medusa, the Medusansa, if you will. So I'll show you what that means for Sansa's future, and specifically her triumph over Petyr. And then the third major bit of folklore that George has used to fashion Sansa's story would be the Persephone mythology. And so we'll decode that, and turns out that also foreshadows how Sansa will escape from Petyr's control, and also perhaps Petyr's death. And yes, in case you haven't heard, George Martin himself has clarified that all the Stark children are skin changers, even though Sansa's wolf lady, of course, tragically died before Sansa could ever use her skin changer powers. So today I'm going to show you the foreshadowing that might point to Sansa learning to skin change birds, likely to spy on Petyr and eventually outwit him. And yes, this is the reason for Sansa's nickname, Little Bird. And shout out Big Bird. Speaking of big birds, I do think that Bran is going to play a role in Sansa's plot. And of course, Bran, his name means raven in Welsh. And Bran's main mythical inspiration is Bran the Blessed, who is a giant. So again, Big Bird. And yeah, I think that Bran is going to use his psychic powers to boop Sansa on the forehead and awaken her skin changer gifts, just like he did to Jon Snow, and just like Bloodraven, as the three-eyed crow, did to Bran. Boop! And so today I will show you the clues that I think point in that direction. The direction of you get it. Now, do make sure you stick around until the end of the video, I would say that, but in the last section, we're going to talk about the book To Kill a Mockingbird. That's right, I didn't just name this episode To Kill a Mockingbird to be cute. Sansa and Petyr's story does seem to be, in many ways, inspired by the classic novel, and I'm actually really excited. Not actually, I'm always excited, but it's really cool what George did. It's very creative, so I am excited really about all of this Sansa stuff. We are cooking with Sansa today. And so this theory will take us from the Eyrie to Winterfell, and I might just have a little sneak preview of the 3D Winterfell crypts that I was able to commission thanks to all of your support. Thank you, patrons. Thank you, YouTube channel member Squishers. And this is from 3D artist Chetan Biswas, who gave us our High Tower and Fewstone Fortress of Old Town. And there is, in fact, a giant Secrets of Winterfell Explained produced video on the way very soon, as well as an Arya Stark What Do the Faceless Men Want with Arya video. So, you know what I'm about to say. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. And if you want to keep seeing the channel grow and making videos until Winds of Winter comes out, I am determined to keep making videos until George puts that, and then also afterward. Then one of the best things you can do is just interact with the channel. Click the thumbs up, leave a comment. If you're a part of any cool Facebook groups, share the video. And with that said, let's play the intro music. Boop. All right, let's start this off by talking about the Medusansa, because it's very terrifying. And of course, I am referring to the Ghost of High Heart's not one, but two Weirwood visions of Sansa. And if you think about it, it's kind of remarkable that Sansa is perceived so much by the Ghost of High Heart, since Sansa's story so far has not really been a magical one, but rather one firmly rooted in politics and personal drama. And by personal drama, I mean Petyr Baelish's sick and malevolent obsession with Catelyn, the Starks, and now Sansa. The way I generally see dreams and visions in A Song of Ice and Fire working is that psychics usually see either major world-shaping events or things that relate to them personally in their various visions. And so the fact the Ghost of High Heart sees her twice means that Sansa's story is important. It is helping to shape the world. And so here is what the Ghost of High Heart said about Sansa.
I dreamt of a maid at a feast with purple serpents in her hair, venom dripping from their fangs. And later I dreamt that maid again, slaying a savage giant in a castle built of snow.
So this is very easy to identify as Sansa, right? The first vision is a vision of Sansa's part in Joffrey's death at the Purple Wedding, and the second is of her eventual triumph over Petyr. So tackling the first one first, we have Sansa as the Medusa, as a gorgon with a nest of serpents in her hair, dripping venom, and clearly this seems to be a symbolic dream representation of the dark purple crystal containing the strangler poison that was placed in Sansa's hairnet as a fake black amethyst from a shy. The Queen of Thorns took the poison from Sansa's hairnet when she pretended to adjust it and presumably plonked it into Joffrey's oversized wedding chalice. And in this way, there was a venomous serpent in Sansa's hairnet, although serpents have venom and that was poison, but it's more or less the same idea. And, wouldn't you know it, Medusansa has turned Joffrey to stone. Joffrey began to claw at his throat, his nails tearing bloody gouges in the flesh. Beneath the skin, the muscles stood out hard as stone. So just to give you guys a little glimpse behind the curtain of how I put these essays together, I didn't know there was a Joffrey turning to stone reference at the Purple Wedding until I sat down to write this essay and was thinking about Sansa as the Medusa, and I was just like, hey, I wonder if when Joffrey dies there's some sort of turning to stone reference. And so I thumbed through my searchofIceandfire.com, and it turns out there it was. And so this is kind of how you know you're not chasing shadows, trying to follow Martin's symbolic parallels and, his use of folklore and classic literature. There's a lot going on in Ice and Fire, but once you catch on to what he's doing, the clues are then kind of like right where you'd expect them. And so yes, Sansa's Medusa image inside the Ghost of Highheart's vision is matched with another reference to the Medusa when Joffrey dies, his neck turning to stone, as if he has seen the Gorgon. And then in a little bit of a reversal, there's going to be a lot of reversals and inversions today. Sansa herself also turns to stone by being renamed Elaine Stone. Now, more meaningfully, we have the death of Medusa. Her head was cut off by Perseus, who then carries it around in a sack so that he can pull it out and turn his enemies to stone at need. And then eventually he gives it to Athena, who puts it on her shield. The Medusa's head is now on Athena's shield. So man, that sucks. Sansa's gonna get her head cut off. What a shitty video. Except that no, that fate was given to her direwolf lady instead. We've already suffered through this part of the symbolism. And now that I think about it, Ned was also beheaded, and so was Robb. And Robb's Wolf Grey Wind. And yes, by the way, Ned does actually behead Lady. I went back and checked. We're not going to read the quote because it's very sad. But he does behead her with ice the same way that he beheads the runaway White Walker spooked Night's Watch Ranger Garrett in that first chapter. So Sansa's wolf lady suffers the Medusa fate, and of course there are wolves on the Stark shields. It's not a head like on the show, it's a whole wolf in the book canon. So that may just be coincidence, but I do think it's intentional that just as Perseus uses Medusa's head as a weapon, Petyr Baelish is using Sansa's head, meaning her identity, to amass power for himself, or at least he's planning to. Most importantly, I suspect that Petyr will have his head cut off in, a big inversion of the Medusa myth. And in fact, we're going to find evidence for that basically all through this video. So let's go on to the next section and talk about the vision of Sansa slaying the savage giant in a castle made of snow. All right, yes, so that second Ghost of Highheart Sansa vision does include Petyr as the savage giant in the snow castle, whom Sansa is apparently going to slay. So slay queen. And the key quote that helps us interpret this comes from A Feast for Crows when Petyr takes Sansa to his rundown old keep on the Fingers. I think he called it Sheep Shit Palace or something like that. Above the hearth hung a broken longsword and a battered oaken shield, its paint cracked and flaking. The device painted on the shield was one Sansa did not know, a gray stone head with fiery eyes upon a light green field. My grandfather's shield, Petyr explained when he saw her gazing at it. His own father was born in Bravos and came to the Vale as a sellsword in the hire of Lord Corbray. So my grandfather took the head of the Titan as his sigil when he was knighted. It's very fierce, said Sansa. Rather too fierce for an amiable fellow like me, said Petyr. I much prefer my mockingbird. So as you can see, Petyr is a giant by way of his old sigil, his grandfather's sigil, except this giant has already been decapitated because it's just the Titan's head on the shield. This would seem like a good reference to Medusa's severed head being on Athena's shield, and a big clue that Petyr will be beheaded. That's how he will be slain. He will be beheaded. And have no doubt that Petyr is savage. I mean, he's engineered Ned's downfall, plotting that thing for years, as well as Joffrey's murder. And as far as the snow castle goes, it's not just the snow castle that Sansa makes at the Eyrie, although we will talk about that. It's the Eyrie itself. During those scenes, it's covered in snow and ice, and it is in fact described as a snow castle. Now, getting back to the beheading thing, it's definitely going to happen.
It was my fault.
Sansa showed them the doll's head.
I ripped his doll in two. I never meant to, but...
Damn, Sansa, ripping the kid's doll. How could you? This, of course, is the doll of sweet Robin Arryn, whom Robin introduced as a giant tromp, as he destroyed Snow Castle Winterfell.
It's not so great.
The boy knelt before the gatehouse.
Look, here comes a giant to knock it down.
He stood his doll in the snow and moved it jerkily.
Tromp, I'm a giant,
he chanted.
Ho, 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 open your gates or I'll mash them and smash them.
Swinging the doll by the legs, he knocked the top off one gatehouse tower and then the other. It was more than Sansa could stand.
Robert, stop that.
Instead, he swung the doll again, and a foot of wall exploded. She grabbed for his hand, but she caught the doll instead. There was a loud ripping sound as the thin cloth tore. Suddenly, she had the doll's head. Robert had the legs and body, and the rag and sawdust stuffing was spilling in the snow. Lord Robert's mouth trembled.
You killed him,
he wailed. Then he began to shake. It started with no more than a little shivering, but within a few short heartbeats, he had collapsed across the castle, his limbs flailing about violently. White towers and snowy bridges shattered and fell on all sides. Sansa stood horrified, but Petyr Baelish seized her cousin's wrists and shouted for the maester. And so right here we have the fulfillment of the Ghost of High Heart's prophecy. Sansa has slain the savage giant in the snow castle, but of course, the Ghost of High Heart was not prophesying about this event, and we should instead see this event as yet another literary foreshadowing to the ultimate giant slaying of Petyr Baelish, which is what the Ghost of High Heart was ultimately talking about. But as you can see, Petyr's definitely going to lose his head. Meanwhile, Sansa is not done committing atrocities and war crimes. A mad rage seized hold of her. She picked up a broken branch and smashed the torn doll's head down on top of it, then pushed it down atop the shattered gatehouse of her snow castle. The servants looked aghast, but when Littlefinger saw what she'd done, he laughed. If tales be true, that's not the first giant to end up with his head on Winterfell's walls. Those are only stories, she said, and left him there. So a little bit ambiguous wording there. She left him there. She left the giant's head. She left Petyr there. And indeed, I believe that Sansa will leave Petyr there at Winterfell with his head mounted on a spike, most likely. Now, one thing to note about this roleplay is that the Snow Castle serves as a model of both the Eyrie and Winterfell. Like I said, the Eyrie is described as an ice castle with snowy towers, but Sansa is calling this and thinking about this as Winterfell. So when we think about what the potential meaning could be of the giant ruining the snow castle here, well, real Winterfell is already in ruins. So perhaps Sansa building Winterfell here is, an indication that Sansa will eventually help rebuild Winterfell. But when we think about the Eyrie potentially being ruined by a giant, well, the Eyrie is sitting on the shoulder of a giant mountain called the Giant's Lance. Giants waking in the earth is, of course, a famous Westerosi folk euphemism for earthquakes, and Sweet Robin's convulsing atop the castle does seem like kind of a representation of that idea. The giants waking and trembling, and the earth is trembling with it, and the castles are crumbling down. Specifically, the Eyrie is crumbling in this metaphor. So perhaps there will be an earthquake in Westeros. Perhaps there's, some dormant fault lines or even dormant volcanoes in the Eyrie somewhere, even under the Giant's Lance. And so what could trigger an earthquake? Well, the author, of course, but if there is a moon meteor apocalypse event, falling comets and meteors do sometimes often depending on their size, how big they are when they impact the Earth, they can trigger earthquakes and even volcanoes. Sticking with Sansa though, main topic for today, I think the obvious takeaway here is that Sansa will probably slay Petyr at Winterfell. And it kind of has to be that way since they've already left the Eyrie, it's all snowed in, and it would be more or less impossible to get back there at this point anyway. At least until after winter has ended. So now let's get into that Idunn Norse myth, which very much builds on, or maybe the inspiration for all this giant in an ice castle imagery of the ghost of High Heart Vision. All right, let's talk about dem apples, I guess. It's kind of a dated reference, but yeah. A Sansa is a type of apple, in case you didn't know. And I do think the reason George named Sansa after an apple is because of the Idunn myth. Idunn is the most trustworthy goddess, so trustworthy and honest that she alone is given the charge of keeping the very important apples of immortality upon which the Aesir, meaning the gods, depend to stay forever young and ageless. That's right, they're not naturally immortal. So if someone were to abduct Idunn and those apples, they'd be in a lot of trouble. So Idunn's name means, apparently, ever young, the rejuvenator, or the rejuvenating one. Now, I'm going to put a link in the description to a YouTube channel named John Solo, who has a nice, short, but very informative video about Idunn mythology. For those of you who want to go a little deeper, we're just going to do the short version today. And basically, the story begins with Loki getting himself into hot water with a Jotun, which means giant, named Thiazi, who, like many Jotnar, can shapeshift into other forms. And Jotnar, that's just the plural of Jotun. And although they're not always giants, but they're more or less equivalent. And yeah, many of the Jotnar can change their forms, and Thiazi, he can turn into a giant eagle. So like I said, Loki, he got into hot water. He attempted to spear Thiazi, the giant eagle, but the spear just got stuck in his feathers, and Thiazi took off, and now Loki's dangling from the spear and he's, begging for his life. So Thiazi, in return for not just dropping Loki and killing him, he makes Loki promise to lure Idunn into this specific forest by telling her that, he's got some apples that are even more incredible than the ones that she has. This Loki does, and predictably, Thiazi, the giant eagle, or in giant eagle form, he swoops down and abducts Idunn and carries her back to his snowy mountain fastness known as Thunderhome, which is Thrymheim. And that's located in Jotunheim, which is the land of the Jotnar, and that exists beyond the realm of mortals. So it's easy to see the immediate parallels to Sansa's plot, right? Sansa is an innocent and honest apple maiden who is abducted to a snowy castle in the mountains by a shape-shifting trickster associated with birds. That's Petyr Baelish, the mockingbird, of course, with the mockingbird itself serving, in this case, as a symbol of trickster figures like Loki or Thiazi, because the mockingbird obviously can mimic other people's calls and trick people. And then, as we discussed, Petyr is also a giant like Thiazi the Jotun because of his grandfather's Titan head sigil. So it's very tight. Sansa has been abducted by a giant who turns into a bird, and she's in a snowy castle in the mountains, and she is an apple maiden like Idunn. So now, just as Idunn is kidnapped and fought over because she is the key to the vitality of the Aesir, Sansa is kidnapped and fought over because she is regarded as the key to Winterfell by all the plotters in King's Landing, such as Petyr and the Lannisters and even the Tyrells. So then, as we go back for the rest of the Idunn story, we find more parallels to Sansa. Now Loki, he's in hot water with the Aesir because they've begun to age, and they notice the apples are gone, and they eventually figured out that Idunn was last seen with Loki. The Aesir gods threaten Loki with cruel torture and force him to go try to rescue Idunn, which he is supposed to do with the aid of a magical cloak of Freya's that allows Loki to transform into a falcon. And yes, we should be thinking of the moon and falcon sigil of House Arryn of the Eyrie at this point. Obviously, there's a lot of birds up there in the Eyrie, from the Arryn falcon to Petyr's mockingbird to Sansa the little bird. And of course, Sweet Robin is up there too. There's 4 different kinds of birds up there. Anyway, must be a theme or something. But getting back to Loki, he's now disguised as a falcon, and so he flies to the mountain fastness, Thiazi's mountain fastness of Thrymheim, and comes upon Idunn as Thiazi is away, conveniently. And since Loki as a falcon is not as big as the giant eagle Thiazi, he's got to transform Idunn into something much smaller that he can carry. And so he transforms her into a chestnut. And what color does Sansa dye her hair when she takes up the identity of Elaine Stone in the Eyrie? That's right, chestnut brown. And so in this way, Sansa has transformed into a chestnut in the Snow Castle, just like Idunn. So now Loki the Falcon is flying away. He's fleeing the castle with chestnut Idunn grasped in his talons. But the Aussie is now in hot pursuit and he's coming up fast. So the gods kindle a huge fire just behind the gates of Asgard. A fire which Loki is able to avoid, but which the Aussie flies right into. It burns his feathers, he crash lands, and all the Aesir descend like Varys' little birds with the knives in their hands, and they murder him. And so Idunn is saved, the apples are recovered, and the gods are once again ageless and eternal. So thinking about this last part of this story, this seems to line up with the idea of Sansa fleeing the Eyrie back to Winterfell, with Petyr pursuing her to Winterfell, and eventually Sansa slaying him there. Somewhat like what happened on the show, minus the senseless marriage of Sansa to Ramsay Bolton that made just no plot sense whatsoever. What I find most intriguing here, perhaps, is the implication that Sansa, instead of just being rescued, will actually be her own rescuer. The ghost of High Heart Vision is of a maid in a castle slaying a savage giant, and that implies that Sansa is going to have an active role, a lot of agency in Petyr's downfall. And if Sansa is able to awaken her skin changer powers and skin change birds, which we're going to talk about, then she would be playing the Loki rescuer role as well by transforming into a bird in order to escape the mountain castle, which is what I mean by Sansa is going to be her own rescuer in a way. Even so, it is possible that she will receive help from another Falcon character, such as Harold Harding, aka Harry the Heir. He does have Arryn blood, and that's why he's the heir, and his sigil is quartered with the Arryn Moon and Falcon. Sansa could also be aided by the Falcon Sweet Robin. He's still a Falcon, and even though he's, kind of pathetic or whatever, if Sansa were able to convince Sweet Robin that Petyr was the one who killed his mother, then Sweet Robin could indeed help Sansa topple Petyr from power. And even though Harry does seem like he might be a creep, we don't know that for sure. I'd put it in the probably category, but we don't know how far that goes. And either way, we can see from the Winds of Winter Sansa sample chapter, which we're going to get into this Sunday, by the way, with Estella Graves. She's going to come on and we're going to do a little Winds of Winter Sansa predictions and dive into that Elaine chapter. But yeah, in that chapter, we can see Sansa is already learning to manipulate Harry the Heir. So he may aid her escape from the Eyrie unwittingly, or maybe she'll just win him over. But yeah, there are a couple of Falcons that could help her escape. And there's also one more bird that I think is definitely going to help Sansa escape, and that would be Bran the Raven. But I'm saving that for the Skin Changer section. Oh, and one other thing, if Harry the Heir marries Sansa, then he will in fact drape that falcon cloak over Sansa's shoulders per Westerosi custom, and that feels a lot like a gender-inverted reference to Loki putting on Freya's magical cloak that turned him into a falcon. And so once again, we see Sansa in the Loki role, taking the falcon cloak and becoming a falcon, and this, again, puts Sansa in the potential role of being her own rescuer. All right, so there is one more Idunn-related Sansa idea, but it's going to bring us to the Persephone stuff. So here we are in the Persephone section, because Idunn is a spring goddess, and the story of her abduction is a seasonal myth, very much along the same lines of the story of the abduction of Persephone. That's why Idunn is stolen away to a winter castle, and again, Jotunheim is beyond the realm of mortals, and also why the Aesir lose their vitality when she and her spring apples, if you will, are gone. As most of you will probably know, Persephone's abduction by Hades down to the underworld and the resulting displeasure of Persephone's mother Demeter is essentially given as a mythical explanation for winter and for the cycle of the seasons as a whole. Winter comes when Persephone is gone and Demeter is pissed, and spring returns when Persephone returns and Demeter is happy. Accordingly, Sansa is abducted right as winter falls, right as Westeros falls into chaos and barbarism, and right as Winterfell comes to be ruined and abandoned and eventually held in enemy hands. We should probably expect Sansa's return to her true Stark self and her return to Winterfell to come as the Starks are helping to end a long night and usher in the new spring. And this would be very similar and also highly complementary to the idea of Bran as a Summer King with the wolf named Summer, who goes in the far north and hides in the cave of night just as winter is falling, and who is most likely to surface again to help chase away the winter and bring the spring and the summer, and generally just to return life to the land of the living. Now, the big memorable symbol from the Persephone story, of course, it's the pomegranate. You know, Persephone's got to return to the underworld for half the year, even after being freed, because she had already eaten of the food of the underworld while she was there in the form of the pomegranate. This is also why Bowen Marsh's nickname is the Old Pomegranate. He's the one who kills Jon Snow, or one of the people who kills Jon Snow, and drags him down to hell, to Hades, in other words. So, with all that in mind, here is the pomegranate scene, so to speak, between Petyr and Sansa, again, at Petyr's little run-down sheep tower on the Fingers. Griselle reappeared before he could say more, balancing a large platter. She set it down between them. There were apples and pears and pomegranates, some sad-looking grapes, a huge blood orange. The old woman had brought a round of bread as well and a crock of butter. Petyr cut a pomegranate in two with his dagger, offering half to Sansa. "You should try and eat, my lady." "Thank you, my lord." Pomegranate seeds were so messy. Sansa chose a pear instead and took a small, delicate bite. It was very ripe. The juice ran down her chin. Lord Petyr loosened a seed with the point of his dagger. "You must miss your father terribly, I know. Lord Eddard was a brave man, honest and loyal, but quite a hopeless player." He brought the seed to his mouth with the knife. In King's Landing, there are two sorts of people, the players and the pieces. So first of all, take note of the fact that Petyr is talking about Sansa missing her dead father and why her father died as he is eating the pomegranate seed. Eddard is the one who has been sent to the underworld here, and by Petyr himself with the same knife. So you can see him picking the seed out of the pomegranate with the knife, you know, as being a representation of him picking people out of the pattern of life and swallowing them down to Hades. And thus, it is very hopeful and promising that Sansa refuses Petyr's offered pomegranate seeds. It means that she is not going to be stuck in Petyr's personal hell. And by the way, the fact that Petyr sails around on a boat called the Merling King is yet more underworld Hades symbolism for Petyr. And his last name, Baelish, ties him into the Bael the Bard mythology, which is also about abducting Stark women. That's a little off the beaten path. Maybe me and Estella will get to that in the live stream this Sunday. But yeah, Sansa, she chooses the pear instead, and only takes the briefest of Google searches on the symbolism of the pear to see that it's most commonly associated with longevity, prosperity, and even immortality. So it's just the opposite symbolism of the pomegranate, which makes me say, this is all intentional food symbolism from George Martin, which he does a lot. I've almost been afraid to get into it, but yes, he does use the food as symbolism, and all of it is pointing in the same direction in this scene. Like I said, Sansa is fated to escape Petyr's little hell, or you might say that she's fated to escape Thiazi's frozen mountain fastness. Petyr, meanwhile, he smiled, his thin lips bright red from the pomegranate seeds. So then, the symbolism gets even worse for Petyr as they get into the blood orange, which was the other major food symbolism that was offered on the tray with the pomegranates. Lord Petyr cut the blood orange in two with his dagger and offered half to Sansa. "The lads are far too treacherous to be part of any such scheme, and Osmond has become especially unreliable since he joined the Kingsguard. That white cloak does things to a man, I find, even a man like him." He tilted his chin back and squeezed the blood orange so the juice ran down into his mouth. "I love the juice, but loathe the sticky fingers," he complained, wiping his hands. "Clean hands, Sansa. Whatever you do, make certain your hands are clean." Sansa spooned up some juice from her own orange. So Petyr's lack of self-awareness is truly spectacular here. I'm sure you picked up on that. He's talking about having clean hands when you do crimes, as he's getting the blood orange fruit blood all over his hands and face. Meanwhile, there's Sansa neatly spooning up a little bit of the juice with a spoon and keeping her hands clean. So it's safe to say Petyr's not very good at symbolism. But we can see what Martin is doing here very easily. Sansa is more than learning the lessons that are being offered. She's already starting to see through Petyr's bullshit, and she's well on her way to outwitting him. The student will eventually become the master. The piece will become the player. Shout out to pawn to player and all the great work they've done on Sansa over the years. So yeah, there's Petyr with the incriminating underworld pomegranate blood all over his hands and face, and thus we have another very strong clue that Sansa will eventually have victory over Petyr, and that this will result in Petyr's death, in Petyr being sent to the underworld. All right, so my sort of intuitive idea with this theory has always been that Bran will give Sansa a spirit boop on her third eye, the way that Bran did for Jon, and the way that Bloodraven, as the three-eyed crow, which he definitely is, did for Bran. I'm sure everyone watching this remembers Bran's dream with the three-eyed crow pecking open his third eye on his forehead, and how Bran then woke and his forehead still feels warm or hot to the touch. So I don't think we need to quote that scene, but we are going to quote the one where Bran reaches out in spirit tree form to awaken Jon's skin-changing gifts in the Frostfangs, because I think he's going to do more or less exactly the same thing for Sansa. So this is when Jon is with Corn Halfhand and Ebon and Stone Snake and good old Squire Dalbridge, again, in the Frostfangs. And this is when they're on the way to the Skirling Pass. They're still looking for the wildlings. And we have Jon going to sleep and having a wolf dream where he hears Bran calling out to him. "Jon?" The call came from behind him, softer than a whisper, but strong too. Can a shout be silent? He turned his head, searching for his brother, for a glimpse of a lean gray shape moving beneath the trees. But there was nothing, only a weirwood. It seemed to sprout from solid rock, its pale roots twisting up from a myriad of fissures and hairline cracks. The tree was slender compared to other weirwoods he had seen, no more than a sapling, yet it was growing as he watched, its limbs thickening as they reached for the sky. Wary, he circled the smooth white trunk until he came to the face. Red eyes looked at him. Fierce eyes they were, yet glad to see him. The weirwood had his brother's face. Had his brother always had 3 eyes? "Not always," came the silent shout. "Not before the crow." All right, so here the Bran-faced weirwood, or maybe the summer-faced weirwood. It's hard to say what Jon as Ghost means when he says the weirwood had his brother's face. But yeah, this is Bran somehow in the form of a 3-eyed weirwood tree. And he's referring to when the 3-eyed crow opened his third eye in the coma dream. And he says, "Oh yeah, I can contact you now like this because the crow booped me." Then he goes on to tell Jon, "Don't be afraid. I like it in the dark. No one can see you, but you can see them. But first, you have to open your eyes. See? Like this." And the tree reached down and touched him. And suddenly he was back in the mountains, his paws sunk deep into a drift of snow as he stood upon the edge of a great precipice. All right, so what's happened here is that Jon starts off in this sort of hazy, symbolic wolf dream, but after he's booped by the Bran tree, he's now literally skin-changing Ghost for the first time. He's seeing out of Ghost's eyes. Ghost is awake. He is in the Frostfangs. He's looking down on the wildling camp, and we know that that is true because Jon feels Orell's eagle attack Ghost, which is definitely happening in reality. So yes, this is the first time that Jon ever has fully skin-changed Ghost and looked out of the eyes of his wolf. And it was Bran who facilitated it. So might not Bran do the same for Sansa? Now, it's interesting to think about Arya for a second. No one has booped her yet. We've seen her kind of unintentionally warging Nymeria in her dreams, but never intentionally in waking life. She has now moved on to skin-changing the cat. That does seem intentional, and she was doing that to outwit the kindly man, kind of like I'm saying Sansa's going to use bird skin-changing to outwit Petyr. So it may be that Bran will eventually boop Arya when she gets back to Westeros and, make her a fully intentional and powerful skin changer who can skin change Nymeria at will. Or it may be that Arya's third eye is gradually opening by itself through so much unintentional dream skin changing, sharing of the skin with Nymeria. But the thing is, Sansa, she doesn't have her direwolf anymore to help spur on her magic in dreams or whatever. And so she really would need a spirit boop of awakening from Bran in order to awaken her skin changing powers to use on birds. And Bran can do this. We've seen that he can. So this brings us back to the Thiazi Idunn legend and the idea that Bran could play the Loki role of a bird transforming magician who helps Sansa Idunn escape from the mountain fastness. Bran could obviously do this by reaching out to Sansa in the astral realm, awakening her magic, And if Sansa then uses that magic to escape Petyr, well, that's a pretty good match for the legend. Now, Bran did appear to Jon as a tree and not a bird, but again, his name means raven or crow, and we do know that psychics can appear in different forms in the dream realm, since Melisandre perceived Bran as a boy with a wolf's head and not a three-eyed weirwood tree. And then Jojen, of course, way back in the first book, he saw Bran, or actually before the first book, but you get the point, he saw Bran as the winged wolf bound by chains. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the famous Ghost Wolf passage, which comes as Sansa and Sweet Robin cross that dreadful, thin arch bridge of stone on the way down from the Eyrie. She helped the boy dismount, and hand in hand they walked out onto the bare stone saddle, their cloaks snapping and flapping behind them. All around was empty air and sky, the ground falling away sharply to either side. There was ice underfoot and broken stones just waiting to turn an ankle, and the wind was howling fiercely. It sounds like a wolf, thought Sansa. A ghost wolf, big as mountains. All right, so Sansa, the little bird, and Sweet Robin, who is a falcon called Robin, they are both birds in this scene with their cloaks flapping as empty air and sky are all around them. So they're birds flying together, and that's when Sansa hears the ghost wolf howl. And although this is certainly meant to sort of poetically evoke the idea that Sansa's wolf lady is still watching out for her somehow, it could certainly also function as foreshadowing that Bran's spirit will reach across the mountains to communicate with Sansa. Now, this may be where the famous Sweet Robin Bran parallel becomes very important. So in case you're not hip to this, Sweet Robin is Bran's cousin. They're either the same age or almost the same age. Sweet Robin sits on a weirwood throne like Bran, and the porridge he's always being fed, and which is laced with drugs, the drug Sweet Sleep, would seem to serve as a parallel to the psychedelic weirwood paste that is drugs that Bran is fed. Bran uses the weirwood tree to fly, and Sweet Robin makes people fly out of the weirwood moon door. Even Sweet Robin's shaking sickness seems like a sort of cryptic reference to the old idea that shamans are associated with schizophrenia and things like that. So as we just saw, Sweet Robin and Sansa are like birds, symbolically flying, cloaks flapping, in the moment that Sansa hears the ghost wolf. So maybe in the future it won't be Sweet Robin, but rather Bran and Sansa flying in the spirit realm together, just as the three-eyed crow was flying with Bran as he was pecking his third eye open. And remember, Bran is the winged wolf, so his spirit visiting Sansa on the astral plane, that would be like a ghost wolf. I know Jon's wolf is actually the one named Ghost, but Bran's spirit is like a ghost wolf. Now, as it happens, Bran actually thinks about teaching his other Stark siblings to skin change birds, in fact, the very first time that he himself ever wears the skin of a raven.
It was the singers who taught the first men to send messages by raven. But in those days, the birds would speak the words. The trees remember, but men forget. And so now they write the messages on parchment and tie them round the feet of birds who have never shared their skin.
Old Nan had told him the same story once, Bran remembered, but when he asked Robb if it was true, his brother laughed and asked him if he believed in Grumpkins too. He wished Robb were with them now. I'd tell him I could fly, but he wouldn't believe, so I'd have to show him. I bet that he could learn to fly too. Him and Arya and Sansa, even baby Rickon and Jon Snow. We could all be ravens and live in Maester Luwin's rookery. So not only is Bran thinking about teaching Sansa and the rest to fly as birds, he's also expressing what seems to be his heart's desire to reunite his family at Winterfell, which of course makes a lot of sense. All the Stark kids essentially have lost their family and been orphaned in a way, and that is exactly what I think Bran is going to be doing in the last two books. That's going to be a major part of his endgame plot. He's going to teach his siblings to use the psychic communication that comes along with skin changing, so the Stark siblings can eventually be in constant mental contact with each other just like the wolves are, thereby facilitating the Stark family reunion that we've all been waiting for years. So that's pretty cool, right? Bran's going to help reunite the Stark family and help awaken their magic, and I think Sansa is probably next on the list. Now, the idea of Sansa turning into a bird to fly away from danger, just as Loki did with Idunn, also seems to be implied in the famous rumor that is spread about Sansa's flight from King's Landing, which is what landed her in the Eyrie. So Arya and the Hound are talking with Polliver and the Tickler. It's that scene in the inn. And this is right before the big bloody fight. And Polliver is bringing them up on the news. He's telling them about the news of Joffrey's death at the Purple Wedding. And he's blaming it on the imp and his wife. And so the Hound is like, "What wife?" And Polliver says,
"The northern girl, Winterfell's daughter. We heard she killed the king with a spell and afterward changed into a wolf with big leather wings like a bat and flew out a tower window. But she left the dwarf behind and Cersei means to have his head."
So then Arya thinks that's stupid. Sansa knows songs, not spells, and she'd never marry the imp. But of course, Sansa did marry the imp. So maybe she will learn spells too. Ones where she can grow wings and fly away from danger, just like they're talking about in this rumor. And then we can't help but notice this wolf with bat wings is very close to Bran's winged wolf in chains. And of course, those chains were a symbol of Bran not having opened his third eye yet and thus being unable to fly. Thus, it seems somewhat logical to see this expression of Sansa as a wolf with bat wings flying away from the tower as an indication that Sansa will awaken her skin changer magic and fly. I'd like to just give a quick shout out to this stubby middle candle. I trimmed its wick after the first section and it's been holding on for dear life. And we've just got one more section to go. So yes, To Kill a Mockingbird, it's an American literary classic and it's definitely one that George is aware of and drawing from and working with in some pretty creative ways. So the protagonist of To Kill a Mockingbird is a girl with the last name of Finch. She's the daughter of Atticus Finch. Even if you haven't read the book, you've probably heard the name Atticus Finch. So this is Scout Finch. She's a little girl who is a little bird, a finch, a songbird, just like Sansa is a little bird who's always supposed to sing. Hound is always talking about "sing me a song, little bird." And the story, To Kill a Mockingbird, is primarily about the loss of innocence and the struggle against injustice, which is exactly what Sansa's story is about. So in the original story, the expression "to kill a mockingbird" uses mockingbirds and songbirds in general, like the finch, as symbols of innocence and beauty. And so to kill a mockingbird is a sin because, quote, "they don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us." So again, it's easy to see how this applies to Sansa. She's a little bird who's supposed to sing songs, and she's very painfully having her fairy tale notions of honorable knights and lords smashed and shattered. And of course, we're talking about the horrible physical and mental abuse by Joffrey and the Lannisters, even before the sick manipulation of Petyr Baelish. And all of this comes after Petyr manipulated Joffrey to kill Sansa's father, so yeah, the death of Ned really was the death of Sansa's mockingbird. This next quote is from Sansa's time captive in King's Landing. "Perhaps I will die too," she told herself, and the thought did not seem so terrible to her. If she flung herself from the window, she could put an end to her suffering, and in the years to come, the singers would write songs of her grief. Her body would lie on the stones below, broken and innocent, shaming all those who had betrayed her. Sansa went so far as to cross the bedchamber and throw open the shutters, but then her courage left her, and she ran back to her bed, sobbing. So Sansa is thinking about flying in the bad sense here. She's thinking about throwing herself from the window to fall out of the sky like the dead mockingbird of her innocence. The innocence that she is mourning in this very passage. So that's all pretty straightforward, but then Martin brings us a twist. One of the main people responsible for Sansa's situation, the one who killed her father and engineered the downfall of her house, is Petyr the Mockingbird. So what this means is that even while George is well aware of what the symbol of the mockingbird functions as in the story To Kill a Mockingbird, and even though he's using that with Sansa, she is the songbird girl losing her innocence, he's also using the mockingbird as a symbol, again, of a trickster and even a cuckold. This symbolism works because male mockingbirds do, as it turns out, constantly try to cuckold each other when they're not fiercely guarding their own nests from the other males trying to cuckold their females. So Petyr the Mockingbird, obviously, he's taking over the nest of the Arryn Falcons, and many people do suspect that Sweet Robin may be Petyr's son and not Jon Arryn's, in accordance with the cuckolding theme. Mockingbirds are most famous for mimicking, of course, they're very good mimics, and Petyr does this by using Lysa and Kat's secret language to deceive Ned and Kat into believing Petyr's lies, which come cloaked in Lysa's voice. And then on top of that, Petyr is just straight up mocking, especially to Ned when he's in King's Landing. Petyr is merciless. And so the picture being painted here is that Sansa will respond to her own bird innocence being killed by killing a mockingbird, except that it's good and no sin because Petyr the Mockingbird is as guilty as one can be, with blood all over his hands. So that's pretty tasty writing, I think, and a clever implementation of themes and symbolism. And going further, we can recognize the echo of the phrase "to kill a mockingbird," as well as the meaning in the advice that Maester Aemon gives Jon: kill the boy and let the man be born. So Aemon is basically saying, hey, you're only 15 and it sucks that you have to do this, but now that you're Lord Commander, you better go ahead and kill your innocence and become a man. And I mean man in the sense of someone who's capable of making the hard choices. So this is kind of a third idea, a new idea from George in regards to innocence being killed, where it's not expressed as pure sin, but rather as necessary tragedy. And one can definitely argue that Jon took this advice too far by sending all of his friends and allies to other castles on the wall and leaving himself only with wildlings and mutineers. And this isn't just cool literary parallelism, of course. Once again, we are left with a suggestion that Sansa will kill the mockingbird, Petyr Baelish, the one who took her innocence. And then finally, the protagonist of To Kill a Mockingbird, Scout Finch, she ends up in the position, a couple of times, of defending her father against slander, just as Sansa and the other Stark siblings are with Ned. So Scout's father, Atticus Finch, he's a lawyer in the American antebellum South, and he commits the unforgivable sin of defending a black man in court. And so then he had his reputation tarnished, so to speak, in the eyes of the racist folk. And so he ended up being hated for doing the right thing. And that's a lot like Ned, who makes all these political enemies in King's Landing who try to destroy his reputation because he is so stubborn about doing the right thing. Sansa and Jon both defend Ned against slander. Jon jumps on the table and tries to murder, it's Alistair Thorne, I believe, when he says some shit about Ned. And I can't recall if Arya has ever defended Ned, but I'm sure she would. And so, to sum up, Sansa is definitely going to be instrumental in Petyr's downfall and his death, probably by beheading, probably at Winterfell. And I think there's at least a pretty strong chance that Bran helps Sansa awaken her dormant Skinchanger gifts, enabling Sansa to truly become a little bird. And it's really not hard to see how, if Sansa could skin change birds, that could really be useful with Petyr. Petyr's always talking and plotting and making plans, and sending his plans by Raven, actually. So if Sansa can spy using birds, it'll be kind of like Rhaenyra using the, back ways of the Red Keep to spy on people, only much better. And if you think about Varys' little birds in King's Landing, they are children who spy for him. And all of that is set up as a non-magical parallel to Bloodraven, the Green Seer, who's in a cave with children, all of whom use birds to gather information and spy. So Varys is in the walls of the Red Keep, and he's down there in Rugen's cell, in the black cells, or maybe he's in the level right above the black cells, but it's down underground like Bloodraven. And so Varys is like a non-magical Green Seer, a spider, at an information web using little birds to gather information. And those little birds, are paralleled in the Children of the Forest skin-changing ravens. And so that's an extra connotation of skin-changing birds that goes along with the phrase little bird. And so there you have it. Thanks for watching, everyone. Sansa's going to skin-change birds and get Petyr's head cut off. And man, is that going to be satisfying when George gets around to writing it. All right, you've been a beautiful audience. Leave a comment. I'll see you next time. And I'll see you on Sunday again with Estella Graves to do our last Winds of Winter sample chapter reread of this cycle, which is Elaine Stone.